Good day. Today is Thursday, December 26th, 2025. And before I proceed with today's program, let me remind you once again to click the like button if you found value in what you're about to hear, as this analysis will challenge everything you thought you knew about America's latest military adventure. What we are witnessing in the Caribbean today is not simply another counter-narcotics operation. It is nothing less than the final act of a desperate empire attempting to reassert control over what it considers its natural domain, the Western Hemisphere's energy resources. The scale of Operation Southern Spear, with its aircraft carriers, 15,000 troops, and systematic destruction of vessels in international waters, reveals something far more significant than Washington's stated objectives would suggest. But before we examine why this crisis may represent the beginning of the end for American hegemony in Latin America, we must first understand how we arrived at this extraordinary moment. And to do that, we need to go back to 1823 and the Monroe Doctrine, that foundational assertion of American imperial ambition that declared the entire Western Hemisphere as Washington's exclusive sphere of influence. For 2 centuries, the Monroe Doctrine has served as the philosophical backbone of American interventions across Latin America. From the Mexican-American War to the overthrow of governments in Guatemala, Chile, and Nicaragua, Washington has consistently demonstrated its willingness to use military force whenever its regional hegemony appeared threatened. Venezuela, with its massive oil reserves and strategic Caribbean position, has always occupied a special place in this imperial calculus. The discovery of oil in Venezuela in the 1920s transformed the country from a peripheral coffee producer into one of the world's most strategically important nations. By the mid-nth century, American oil companies dominated Venezuelan production, and the profits flowed northward in a pattern that would become familiar across the developing world. This comfortable arrangement persisted until Hugo Chávez's election in 1998 fundamentally altered the equation. Chávez's decision to nationalize key industries and redistribute oil wealth to Venezuela's poor majority represented more than domestic policy reform. It constituted a direct challenge to the economic order that had governed U.S.-Latin American relations for generations. When Chavez began selling oil to China and forging strategic partnerships with Russia, he crossed a red line that Washington had drawn around its hemisphere. The American response was predictable, but ultimately counterproductive. Sanctions, attempted coups, and support for opposition movements only drove Venezuela deeper into the embrace of America's geopolitical rivals. By the time Nicolas Maduro assumed power in 2013, Venezuela had become the centerpiece of a new axis challenging American dominance, an axis that now includes China as the primary economic partner and Russia as the key military ally. This brings us to the current crisis, which began in earnest with President Trump's return to office and his decision to launch Operation Southern Spear. The official justification combating drug trafficking is so transparently inadequate that it barely merits serious discussion. You do not deploy aircraft carriers and conduct systematic airstrikes against vessels in international waters to address narcotic smuggling. Such operations require Coast Guard cutters and cooperation with regional law enforcement, not the largest military deployment in Latin America since the Cold War. What we are actually witnessing is a desperate attempt by Washington to reassert control over Venezuela's energy resources before they are permanently integrated into the China-Russia economic sphere. Venezuela possesses approximately 303 billion barrels of proven oil reserves, roughly 20% of the world's total and nearly 4 times the reserves of the United States itself. This is not merely about energy security. It is about preventing the emergence of an alternative economic bloc that could fundamentally challenge American global dominance. The timing of this escalation reveals the urgency driving American decision makers. China now purchases approximately 80% of Venezuela's oil exports, paying in yuan rather than dollars, and thus undermining the petrodollar system that has anchored American financial hegemony since the 1970s. Each tanker that delivers Venezuelan crude to Chinese refineries represents another step toward a post-Doll global economy, a development that would strike at the very foundation of American power. But here is where the situation becomes truly dangerous for Washington's long-term interests. The deployment of Russian Wagner Group forces to Venezuela, confirmed by multiple intelligence sources, represents Moscow's most direct military challenge to the Monroe Doctrine in over 60 years. These are not symbolic advisors or technical specialists. They are battle-hardened veterans of conflicts in Syria, Africa, and Ukraine, precisely the kind of forces capable of inflicting serious casualties on any American intervention force. Russia's decision to deploy Wagner mercenaries reflects a calculated assessment that America's regional dominance is no longer unassailable. Putin understands that supporting Venezuela costs relatively little compared to the strategic benefits of demonstrating that American threats are increasingly hollow. If Washington proves unable or unwilling to remove Maduro despite its overwhelming military superiority, the message to every government in Latin America will be clear. Alignment with China and Russia offers a viable alternative to subordination to Washington. The Chinese response has been equally revealing. Beijing's immediate condemnation of American vessel seizures and its public statements of support for Venezuela represent a degree of diplomatic boldness that would have been unthinkable even 5 years ago. China's willingness to challenge American actions in what Washington considers its own hemisphere demonstrates how fundamentally the global balance of power has shifted. This is not mere rhetorical posturing. China's economic relationship with Venezuela has become so extensive that any successful American regime change operation would directly threaten billions of dollars in Chinese investments and disrupt supply chains that Beijing considers essential to its energy security. The Chinese leadership appears to have concluded that the risks of confronting America in the Caribbean are outweighed by the necessity of protecting its economic interests and challenging American unilateralism. The military dynamics of this confrontation deserve careful analysis as they reveal why Operation Southern Spear may prove to be a strategic miscalculation of historic proportions. The deployment of the USS Gerald Ford and its strike group certainly demonstrates American naval superiority in Caribbean waters. However, modern warfare is not decided by battleship diplomacy, and the presence of Wagner forces fundamentally complicates any potential American intervention. Wagner mercenaries bring several critical advantages to Venezuelan defense preparations. First, their experience in asymmetric warfare provides expertise that Venezuela's conventional military lacks. Second, their presence creates the possibility of Russian casualties in any American attack, potentially triggering a direct confrontation between nuclear powers. Third, their unofficial status allows Moscow to escalate or de-escalate its involvement while maintaining plausible deniability. Perhaps most importantly, Wagner forces are specifically designed for scenarios exactly like this one, defending Allied governments against American regime change operations. Their deployment to Venezuela suggests that Russia is prepared to make the cost of intervention prohibitively high for Washington, even if it cannot prevent American military success entirely. The economic implications of this crisis extend far beyond Venezuela's borders. Global oil markets have already begun pricing in the possibility of supply disruptions, and any military escalation would likely trigger price spikes that could destabilize economies worldwide. More fundamentally, the systematic seizure of Venezuelan tankers by American forces represents an unprecedented escalation in economic warfare that threatens the basic principles of international maritime trade. Washington's decision to intercept vessels in international waters without clear legal justification sets a dangerous precedent that could be used against American economic interests in the future. If the United States can seize tankers carrying Venezuelan oil, what prevents China from intercepting vessels carrying American natural gas? The erosion of international law that America is now pursuing may ultimately serve to legitimize similar actions by its rivals. The regional response to Operation Southern Spear has been tellingly muted. Traditional American allies like Colombia and Brazil have offered only lukewarm support for Washington's actions, while Mexico has explicitly criticized the vessel seizures as violations of international law. This diplomatic isolation reflects a broader trend across Latin America, where governments increasingly view American interventions as threats to regional stability rather than necessary policing actions. The failure to build meaningful regional support for its Venezuela policy represents another indication of America's declining influence in Latin America. Unlike previous interventions, which could rely on Cold War dynamics to generate Allied support, Operation Southern Spear appears to be largely a unilateral American undertaking, precisely the kind of isolated action that historically marks the decline of imperial powers. But what makes this crisis truly historic is not just its immediate implications, but what it reveals about the broader trajectory of global power. For the first time since the Monroe Doctrine was proclaimed, a coalition of rival powers has demonstrated the capability and willingness to directly challenge American dominance in the Western Hemisphere. The presence of Chinese economic interests and Russian military forces in Venezuela represents a fundamental breach in the hemispheric isolation that has defined American grand strategy for 2 centuries. This development occurs at a moment when American global dominance faces challenges on multiple fronts. The war in Ukraine has demonstrated the limits of Western military industrial capacity, while America's trade war with China has accelerated rather than reverse the emergence of alternative economic blocs. The Venezuela crisis represents another front in this broader struggle, but one where America's traditional advantages, naval supremacy, and regional alliances appear less decisive than in previous conflicts. The parallels with historical moments of imperial decline are becoming impossible to ignore. Just as Britain's inability to maintain control over distant territories signaled the end of the British Empire, America's struggle to enforce its will in its own hemisphere may mark the beginning of a post-American international order. The question is not whether this transition will occur, but how quickly and at what cost. For Venezuela itself, the current crisis represents both an existential threat and a unique opportunity. Maduro's government has survived nearly a decade of American sanctions and pressure, demonstrating a resilience that few observers predicted. The arrival of Russian military support and the deepening of Chinese economic ties provide Caracas with alternatives that no previous Venezuelan government has possessed. However, the costs of this confrontation are becoming increasingly severe for ordinary Venezuelans. The country's oil infrastructure, already degraded by years of underinvestment and sanctions, faces the possibility of direct military attack. The economic consequences of prolonged confrontation with the United States could prove devastating for a population that has already endured years of economic hardship. The humanitarian dimensions of this crisis have received inadequate attention from all parties involved. American decision-makers appear focused primarily on geopolitical calculations, while Russian and Chinese support seems motivated largely by strategic competition rather than genuine concern for Venezuelan welfare. The Venezuelan government, meanwhile, has prioritized regime survival over economic recovery, leaving ordinary citizens to bear the costs of great power rivalry. Looking ahead, several scenarios appear possible, none of them particularly encouraging for American interests. Military intervention remains an option, but one that would likely prove far more costly and less decisive than Washington anticipates. The presence of Wagner forces and the possibility of Chinese economic retaliation would make any such operation a genuine gamble with global stability. Alternatively, the continuation of current policies, sanctions, vessel seizures, and military pressure short of invasion seems likely to prove counterproductive. Each action that fails to remove Maduro demonstrates the limits of American power, while each Chinese oil purchase and Russian weapons delivery strengthens Venezuela's resistance to American pressure. Perhaps most troubling for Washington is the precedent that this crisis is establishing. If Venezuela successfully resists American pressure while maintaining its relationships with China and Russia, other Latin American governments may conclude that the era of automatic deference to Washington has ended. Countries like Nicaragua, Bolivia, and even larger nations like Mexico may begin to explore alternatives to American economic and security partnerships. The implications extend beyond Latin America to America's global position. Allies in Europe and Asia are watching closely to see whether Washington can maintain control over what it considers its core sphere of influence. Failure in Venezuela would inevitably raise questions about American commitments elsewhere, potentially accelerating the multipolar transition that American policy has sought to prevent. What we are witnessing, therefore, is not simply a crisis over one country's oil resources or political system. It is a fundamental test of whether American hegemony can adapt to a world where rival powers possess the capability and willingness to challenge that hegemony directly. The outcome of this test will likely determine the shape of international relations for decades to come. The tragedy is that this confrontation was largely avoidable. Had American policymakers possessed the wisdom to accommodate Venezuela's desire for greater economic independence while maintaining constructive relationships, the current crisis need never have developed. Instead, the reflexive resort to sanctions and pressure has created precisely the outcome that American policy sought to prevent: the integration of Venezuela into an anti-American coalition. This pattern of counterproductive interventions reflects a deeper problem with American foreign policy: the inability to distinguish between vital interests and imperial preferences. Venezuela's oil resources are indeed strategically important, but the attempt to control them through coercion has proven far more costly than any benefits such control might provide. As we move into 2026, this crisis will likely define not only America's relationship with Latin America, but its broader position in an increasingly multipolar world. The stakes could hardly be higher, and the margin for error continues to shrink. Whether wisdom will ultimately prevail over imperial ambition remains to be seen, but the early signs are not encouraging. The financial markets have already begun to price in the possibility of prolonged confrontation, with oil futures climbing steadily as investors assess the risks of supply disruption. Venezuelan crude, despite its heavy nature and processing requirements, remains crucial to several Caribbean refineries that were specifically designed to handle such feedstock. Any sustained military action would immediately affect these facilities and could trigger broader energy shortages across the region. Meanwhile, the diplomatic cost of this confrontation continues to mount. America's closest allies in Europe have remained conspicuously silent about Operation Southern Spear, unwilling to endorse actions that many view as violations of international maritime law. Even within NATO, there are growing concerns that American unilateralism in Venezuela could set precedents that might be used against Western interests elsewhere. The intelligence dimension of this crisis deserves particular attention, as it reveals the sophisticated nature of the confrontation now underway. Russian intelligence services have clearly been active in Venezuela for years, building networks that extend far beyond conventional military cooperation. The recent arrival of advanced surveillance equipment and cybersecurity specialists suggests that Moscow is preparing for a prolonged information warfare campaign. Chinese intelligence presence in Venezuela has been less visible, but potentially more significant. Beijing's approach emphasizes economic intelligence and infrastructure security, focusing on protecting the massive investments that Chinese state-owned enterprises have made in Venezuelan energy sectors. This economic intelligence apparatus provides China with detailed knowledge that could prove crucial in any extended confrontation. For ordinary Venezuelans caught in the middle of this great power rivalry, the human cost continues to escalate. The country's already fragile healthcare system faces additional stress from uncertainty surrounding medical imports, many of which transit through shipping routes now patrolled by American warships. The regional implications of American failure in Venezuela would extend far beyond Latin America. African nations with similar resource endowments have watched the Venezuelan crisis closely, assessing whether alternative partnerships might offer greater sovereignty than traditional relationships with former colonial powers and their American allies. The technological aspects of this confrontation also merit examination. Venezuela's integration into Chinese and Russian digital infrastructure has proceeded rapidly, with Chinese telecommunications equipment and Russian cybersecurity systems now protecting much of the country's critical infrastructure. The currency implications of this crisis have received insufficient attention despite their potential importance. Venezuela's increasing use of Chinese yuan for oil transactions represents part of a broader trend toward dollarization that directly threatens American financial hegemony. Each transaction conducted outside the dollar system weakens the monetary foundations upon which American global power rests. Looking toward 2026 and beyond, this crisis will likely serve as a watershed moment in the transition from American unilaterality to a multipolar international system. The precedents being established in Caribbean waters will influence great power behavior across multiple continents and domains. Whether this transition occurs peacefully will depend on the wisdom or folly of decisions made in Washington, Beijing, and Moscow over the coming months. The ultimate irony may be that America's attempt to reassert dominance accelerates its decline. That concludes today's comprehensive analysis. Remember to subscribe and click the notification bell for regular updates on this critical developing global crisis. More analysis from me.